Hello, my name is Beverly, and when I was married to Edward, I was the main one in charge of managing our finances. Even though Edward worked and contributed financially, his salary was much lower than mine, so I ended up covering most of our household expenses. I didn't mind this arrangement too much because he was my partner, but there was a point where I had to draw a line when it came to his mother, Victoria, constantly asking for handouts. Victoria didn't like me very much. She couldn't stand that I earned more than both her son and her husband. She would often make hurtful comments, saying things like someone like me, a term she used in a very negative way, didn't deserve to have so much money. Thankfully, Edward always stood up for me, defending me against her remarks, and my father-in-law, Mason, was also very supportive. Edward and I had a strong bond. We got married earlier than most people because I was financially stable and wanted to start a family, and Edward fully supported that. We lived in a house that I had bought before we got married. Even though it had a mortgage, I was able to comfortably make the payments, which seemed to bother Victoria even more. One day, she lashed out, saying it was unfair that someone like me, someone she thought didn't deserve it, could own such a nice home when her family had to rent. I admit I am lucky to have such a home, but I didn't like being called unworthy or unintelligent. Victoria even accused me of getting ahead in my career just by flirting with people, claiming that men like Edward and Mason were stuck in low-paying jobs because of their gender. This was not only untrue, but it was also unfair. Both Edward and my father-in-law defended me, telling her that my success came from my hard work and intelligence, not from any manipulation. Victoria's jealousy was obvious and really made family gatherings tense. The tension she created strained relationships within the family, and it became clear that her hostility toward me wasn't going away. It was a part of my life with Edward that I found increasingly difficult to handle, and it showed how difficult money and success can make things in family relationships. I really wanted to get along with Victoria, but her constant resentment eventually made me pull away from her. However, she kept asking for help, and sometimes I gave in, especially when Edward insisted. The real issues started when my mother passed away and left me with a significant inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a good amount for someone like me. Coming from a middle-class background, losing my mom was incredibly hard. She was the last family I had, and her death hit me deeply. Edward was supportive, but he kept bringing up the inheritance, which started to annoy me. He'd ask, "Have you thought about what you want to do with the inheritance? Do you have any plans for it yet?" I had already put the inheritance money into a separate bank account, and at that time, I just didn't want to think about it. I told him, "Edward, I can't focus on the inheritance right now. I'm still grieving for my mom." But even though I was going through such an emotional time, Edward kept bringing it up, saying he was just trying to help me plan, so I wouldn't have to worry about it. These conversations started happening frequently, and I got tired of it. Finally, I asked him directly what he wanted. I said, "Edward, if there's something specific you want to talk about regarding the inheritance, just say it directly." That's when he admitted, "Well, Mom has been looking at houses, but everything she likes is too expensive. What if we help with the down payment and buy her some furniture?" I was shocked. "Are you serious, Edward? I'm not buying your mother a house. What makes you think that's something I would agree to?" Edward was confused by my reaction. "But Beverly, you know my parents are struggling to find something in their budget. Don't you think we should help?" His words made it clear he didn't understand why I didn't want to use my inheritance to buy his mother a house, especially given our complicated relationship and the fact that I was still grieving. This disagreement caused some tension between us. I tried to explain to him that if Victoria was unhappy with her situation, maybe she could go back to work since she had voluntarily left her job. She can earn her house just like I did. I said I wasn't willing to give up my inheritance to someone who treated me poorly, and this led to a big argument between Edward and me. But since the money was mine and I kept it in a private account he couldn't access, he had no choice but to back down. It wasn't about trust. I just couldn't believe that, during such a painful time for me, Edward was pressuring me to use my late mother's money to buy his mother a house. It felt completely wrong. Eventually, the argument settled down, and Edward apologized for putting so much pressure on me. He promised not to bring it up again, and I, maybe naively, believed him. For a while, it seemed like the issue was resolved. Edward told me that Victoria had gone back to work and they could start saving for a house on their own, which made me relieved that the conflict was behind us. But one night, everything changed. I overheard Edward talking in his sleep, something he only did when he was really stressed. I had learned how to calm him down during these moments, but this time, nothing could prepare me for what he muttered. Mom, relax. The bimbo will never find out how we spent her inheritance. You're worrying for no reason. I've got it all under control. His words sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was completely stunned and started questioning everything about our relationship. I needed to know more, so I talked to Mason, Edward's father, hoping he could clarify things. Mason told me, nothing shady is happening. The house is coming along great. Edward has been really helpful, financially speaking. We're close to finalizing everything. That caught me off guard. Wait, what? Edward has been helping with the payments for the house? I couldn't believe it. I had always thought that Victoria and Mason were handling the house expenses on their own. As Mason and I talked more, I realized that Edward had been hiding the truth from both of us. He had been making payments on the house without my knowledge, using my inheritance money to do so. When I confronted Mason about it, he was just as shocked as I was. He admitted, I didn't know Edward was using your money. I thought the payments were coming from his savings. This was a huge revelation. Edward had been lying to both me and Mason, and I realized that he and Victoria had been plotting together all along. The more I uncovered, the worse it got. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a scheme to take advantage of me. I decided to investigate further, especially to find out how they accessed my inheritance. When I checked my bank account, I discovered a large amount of money had been taken. I went to the bank, and they told me that someone had impersonated me to make the withdrawals. Given how similar Victoria looked to me, it wasn't hard to figure out how they managed it without raising any suspicion. I now knew for sure that Edward and Victoria had been deceiving both Mason and me, and they had been using my inheritance for their own benefit without my permission. I was both furious and heartbroken, feeling deeply betrayed by the people I had trusted most. I decided to share everything with Mason, who was just as shocked and upset by what we had uncovered. Together, we carefully planned what to do next, determined to confront Edward and Victoria about their lies. Our plan was simple. Mason would bring Victoria to our house for dinner while I would already be there with Edward, pretending it was just a regular family gathering. Neither Edward nor Victoria suspected anything unusual. As we sat down for dinner, I felt the weight of the moment and knew it was time to confront them. Edward, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. I found something terrible out yesterday. Someone withdrew a large amount of money from my bank account, the one where I keep my inheritance. Edward looked stunned. What? Who would do that? Beverly, which account are you talking about? Taking a deep breath, I said, I'm thinking of calling the police tomorrow. No, don't do that, Edward rushed to say, his face full of panic. Maybe you moved the money by mistake, or maybe there's some mistake with the account. There's no reason to assume the worst. But I didn't back down. I've thought about it a lot. Edward, this missing money is a serious issue, and I feel like the only option now is to involve the police. The color drained from both Edward and Victoria's faces. It was clear they hadn't expected me to react this way. They were both visibly nervous, their bodies tense as they realized they were about to get caught. Mason, keeping calm but with a hint of sarcasm, looked at Victoria and said, I don't see why Beverly shouldn't go to the police. The sooner this is sorted out, the better. Edward tried to calm the situation. Dad, this is sensitive, especially because it's about money. Beverly's already going through a lot, and I don't want to add to her stress. But I wasn't having it. Actually, I am stressed about this money. I want it back, and if I have to go to the police, I will. Seeing how serious I was, Mason added, You're right, Beverly, you have every right to get your money back, and I'll go with you to the police station if you need me. Edward and Victoria exchanged desperate looks, realizing their lies were about to unravel. They were getting anxious, and it seemed they knew the end was near. I watched them. A part of me almost wanted to laugh at how they were frantically trying to cover their tracks, but my anger was stronger, anger at the betrayal and deceit. I was determined to see this through. Despite all their efforts to calm me, I couldn't let it go. I'm going to the police, I said firmly. There's no reason to wait anymore. Edward tried again. Beverly, don't do this. Why don't you just sleep on it for a few days, think it over? No, I replied. The more I think about it, the angrier I get. In fact, why don't we just go to the police now? It's still early. We can sort this out and still make it back in time for dinner. Mason and I were already walking toward the door when Edward and Victoria realized they had no way out. They looked guilty. and with the truth closing in, they finally admitted what they had done. They confessed to using my inheritance to help buy a house. Why, Edward, why would you do this? I asked, my voice thick with disappointment. Edward looked down, struggling to explain. I've always wanted to buy a house for my parents, but I knew I couldn't afford it. I asked you for help, Beverly, but when you said no, I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted to do something nice for them. What you did was wrong, Edward, I replied firmly. We never asked for a big house. It seems like your mom was the one pushing for all of this. Victoria, who was clearly cornered, snapped back. I just want a decent house like anyone else. If Beverly can live in such a nice place, why can't I? Her words stung, but I remained composed. Be careful, Victoria. What you've done is illegal. You stole from me, and I'm still thinking about going to the police. Victoria's attitude shifted, realizing the seriousness of her actions. She went from being defensive to desperate. She tried to appeal to family ties, saying, "We're family, Beverly, please, don't get the police involved. Let's just forgive each other." Edward joined in. Mom's right, Beverly, you're family, and you shouldn't be threatening her like this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Oh, so you think it's okay for me to threaten your mother, Edward? Well, I can do the same to you. If I report this to the police, you'll be arrested too, and I don't think Mason will be around to bail you out. It was clear now that they realized I wasn't backing down. I was done with both of them. After today, I want nothing more to do with either of you. Victoria has always had a sense of entitlement, but this time, she crossed the line. I've made my decision. I'm separating myself from all of this toxicity. Mason, who had been silent up until now, gave me a resigned look and agreed. I think we'll both be consulting divorce lawyers soon. I'm done with you, Edward, I said. You and your mother insulted me, calling me names and trying to intimidate me when I was vulnerable. Now, you'll see what happens when you push me too far. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They hadn't expected things to spiral so quickly. Desperate, Victoria begged Mason not to leave her, while Edward, now tearful, tried to get my attention as I started to walk away. Sorry, he repeated, hoping I would forgive him. They even promised to return the money if it would fix things. I couldn't help but laugh at their pathetic attempts to make it right. I turned my back on them and walked away without saying a word. Just as I was about to leave, there was a knock at the door. Edward opened it, his face turning pale when he saw 3 police officers standing there, ready to arrest them. That's right, I had already called the police and filed a report earlier that day. There was no going back now. As the officers took them away, the full weight of their actions hit home. They couldn't avoid the consequences anymore. I followed through with my decision to file the police report, and Mason supported me through every step. Victoria and Edward threw tantrums as they were escorted to the police cars, but it didn't matter anymore. Edward was released the next day after posting bail, but Victoria stayed in jail, as Mason chose not to bail her out. When Edward came back, he begged me to reconsider the separation, but my decision was final. I had already contacted a lawyer to start the divorce process, and I was also moving forward with the criminal case against them for identity theft and forgery. Edward eventually returned the stolen money, which I reported to the police, but the case was still active. Victoria was later bailed out by other family members, but her situation was far from resolved. Mason, meanwhile, was pursuing a divorce from her. In our state, divorce was straightforward, so it didn't take long before everything was final. Now, both Edward and Victoria face possible prison time and hefty fines for their actions. Their relationship with each other has completely fallen apart, and they no longer speak. They blame each other for everything that went wrong, and their scheme to get money from me not only failed but led to their ruin. As I close this chapter of my life, it's clear their deceitful plan caused them more harm than they could have imagined.